Hello, welcome everyone. Um, I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's event. It's a celebration of Professor Christopher Washburn's new book, Latin Jazz, the Other Jazz. I want to welcome our esteemed panelists, as well as everyone who's come here to attend and participate. Also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the occupied homelands of the Lenape people. So I'm going to introduce everyone, all the panelists today that will be speaking today in the order of their appearance, and then we'll have questions afterwards. After our panelists have spoken, we'll have some time for questions from the audience, and you should see a Q&A box on your screen where you can submit your questions for me to read aloud. So that'll happen after everyone has spoken. So our first speaker today will be Professor Christopher Washburne. He's an associate professor of music at Columbia University and the founder and director of Columbia's Louis Armstrong Jazz Performance Program. He has published numerous articles on jazz, Latin jazz, and salsa. As a trombonist, he has toured extensively with various groups and concertized throughout Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The second speaker will be Miguel Zenon, a multiple Grammy nominee and Guggenheim and MacArthur Fellow. He is widely considered as one of the most groundbreaking and influential saxophonists of his generation. He has also developed a unique voice as a composer and as a conceptualist, concentrating his efforts on perfecting a fine mix between Latin American folkloric music and jazz. I am Kevin Velez. I'm an associate professor in music department as well as in the African American and African Diaspora Studies departments at Columbia University. My publications include Listen But Don't Ask Question, Hawaiian Slacky Guitar Across the Trans-Pacific, and Birds of Fire, Jazz, Rock, Funk, and the Creation of Fusion. And I have a number of articles published in Jazz Perspectives, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Journal for the Society for American Music. Next speaker is Francis Negron Muntaner, professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University, who is also an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and scholar. She is the editor of several books, including Puerto Rican Jam, Rethinking Nationalism and Colonialism, None of the Above, Puerto Ricans in the Global Era, and Sovereign Acts. She also directs Columbia University's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Unfortunately, we were going to have Ana Maria Ochoa Gautier joining us today, but she's unable to, and we miss her. So, without further ado, I hand this over to Chris.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and welcome everyone. I'm so delighted to see so many colleagues and friends joining us today. This is a very special day for me, and I'm very thankful to the Heyman Center and the Society of Fellows and the Division of the Deans for sponsoring this event. Coming out with a book in the time of the pandemic, especially on jazz and Latin jazz, is both very timely and also frustrating, because the book launch should have a live jam session, and you're all invited once we do have that book party to come in, and everybody that is attending today gets free admission, and so I thank you for that. I want to share my screen because I want to show you some slides and play a little bit of music for you to contextualize the book, and then I look so forward to my esteemed colleagues and their comments. I'm so grateful for them being here as well today. You know, this is a labor of love, and in order for, as anybody who's written a book, it really takes a village, and I am grateful for everyone that participated in this village and constructing this, and I am so grateful. The acknowledgments in this book could have been longer than the actual book. But as I said, as a labor of love, this is music that I've dedicated much of my own professional career playing. I've been playing music that's sometimes called Latin jazz for over 30 years, maybe now, no, over 40 years now, yikes. And of course, throughout the years, it's come up with various labels, and here's some that I just put up on the screen for you, among many others. And but I always felt in my jazz history classes and when I would read historical narratives about jazz that the body of music that I loved, the musicians that I were so influential in my life, oftentimes were written out of those histories. They just didn't appear. And so what kind of music am I talking about? So I tried to graph this out, and I called it the Latin jazz continuum for better of anything else, where there on one side there was these Caribbean, South and Central American traditions, folk, dance, popular music, and performance practice. Then on the other side there was this jazz music and its performance practices, and then everything in between was an intercultural shared space where there's a dialogue of influence between the two for many, many years. But the more I listened deeply into that, I realized that there was so much that, this was just an imagined binary in the sense that most of the music that I played existed somewhere on this in this intercultural space and on a different plane. And so I wanted to parse this out. As I went back and started studying the history of this music, I kept coming across this. This is from 2005, the Jazz Times magazine, where it talks about Dizzy Gillespie, the great trumpet player, and Chano Pozo, the great Cuban conguero. It's the birth of Latin jazz. That's the moment that came out. And of course, the time that they collaborated was in the mid-1940s, 1946 to 1948, roughly. Here's a picture of them backstage. And what we can see here is Chano Pozo playing congas and Dizzy Gillespie playing claves. The two sticks that are played together that play a rhythm that you're going to hear about in a moment that really serves as the rhythmic organizing principle for many Afro-Cuban musical styles or Afro-Cuban influenced musical styles. It's this little 5-beat phrase that sounds like this. As I was playing in a salsa club one night, I was writing an article on my Latin jazz, my first Latin jazz, and I was writing about all of the clave rhythms or clave-like rhythms and Caribbean rhythms that I was hearing in jazz pieces, and the musicians came up to me, and it was a combination of Cuban, Puerto Rican, Colombian, and Dominican musicians in that band, and they asked me, "What are you writing?" And I told them what the article was about, and they said, "You're just talking about clave and clave rhythms in jazz? Have you listened to Beethoven lately?" It's in all music. And the way that their perspective of hearing it in so much music besides just jazz, but also in hip hop, in R&B and rock and roll, made me want to go further and look at this connection through these rhythmic little phrases and rhythmic cells. And that's how this project got started. And that was about 25 years ago. And as we start to dig, there's this famous quote by Jelly Roll Morton, a Creole pianist from New Orleans, who was so integral in kind of formulating what what jazz is. And in the late 1930s, he was interviewed and he started to refer to the Spanish tinge. You have to put, in order for jazz to be jazz, there has to be a Spanish tinge. And what he was referring to at that time was the Spanish-speaking nations of Central America, of the Caribbean, and South America, and the influence that they had. And in many ways, it was the rhythmic underpinning of jazz and the foundations of jazz. And you can hear that in a lot of his pieces. And then as I started to go back further and further in time, I came across this ad. And this was something really unusual. This is March 9th, 1917. Now let's think about the backdrop of this. We're still in the middle of World War I. We're right on the cusp of the last major pandemic that we had, the Spanish flu. And this is an article from one of the first appearances of the first band that used the word jazz to be recorded. And in this particular case, it's almost like time travel. You can look into the past and you can see what, in this particular case, white audiences would have been perceiving of this type of music. An entire novelty, and this was produced by one of the major Broadway producers who would go on to produce the Ziegfeld Follies, that John Murray Anderson. And what he bills this as is this whole experience, exotic experience, seance tea dances, whatever that is, and it's featuring Karma in medium mystic dances of the Orient, and Tencita Guerra, a gypsy crystal gazer, and the original jazz dance and the Cuban danson and Ouija boards will be provided. So this is like just a cornucopia of exotica you know, of otherness, of very problematic racist views of otherness. But in this particular case, the kind of two main dances that were popular among white audiences in 1917 being performed at, get this, Reisenweber's at Columbus Circle, whose address is right next door to where Wynton Marsalis and Jazz at Lincoln Center is today. This is kind of like ground central for white audiences' interaction with jazz at this moment. And who do we see here? The original Dixieland Jazz Band. The original 5 white musicians from New Orleans that recorded for the very first time in this year. And when they came, they were playing not only jazz, but they were also performing Cuban danzón as well. Very popular. And this is part of the history that doesn't get written about. It's like you hear about what they recorded, but what they were actually playing and what was the actual practice of these musicians. But what did come from this performance was a review about this new tune that they played where the dancers went crazy, and it was called the Tiger Rag. I want to play that for you, and I'm going to just play a snippet of it because we don't have very much time. But this is just at the moment where this particular song starts to kind of really groove and where the dancers get down. Oftentimes what it would be called is a hot chorus. And remember that rhythm that I just played for you. Now I'll try to clap along when this comes along, but like Zoom is like one of the most ungrooviest mediums of all time, so I'm going to be slightly out of sync, so please forgive the out of timeness of this. But listen to this, this selection. Hold on one moment. Just zip up right here. Here we go. I'll cue you when it comes in. And then earlier on in this selection, this entire piece is infused with Caribbean rhythms. That's what Jelly Roll Morton was talking about in terms of the Spanish tinge. That was the moment where the band would take off and the dancers would be uplifted. And so what I wanted to do is ask, why is this not being written? And where does this come from? And as I traced back the Caribbean influence in New Orleans, I was able to trace it back all the way until the year 1617. So the close relationship of New Orleans with the Caribbean began with the first wave of enslaved peoples to reach its port. Roughly 3,500 enslaved peoples arrived from the islands of Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue. At the time, there were only 3,000 people living in the entire Louisiana territory. So this is doubling the populations in that area. This initial importation infused New Orleans and the lower Mississippi Valley with a nascent Afro-Caribbean black population that established Neo-African belief systems and practices that are still very much present in New Orleans today. The enslaved West Indian peoples also brought a number of Afro-Caribbean music and dance traditions that would play fundamental roles in the performance practices in Congo Square in the ensuing years. Really the very roots of New Orleans musical styles and the very first moments of a black musical practice here in the United States. So in many ways, my idea was to trace back the roots of jazz and Latin jazz. The birth of Latin jazz is really in the year 1716, way before 1946 with Dizzy Gillespie, and way before even the birth of jazz. This is where it gets started. Let me just go back to this. And of course, we can see, though, that in this particular case, and in also other early accounts, oftentimes jazz would be referred to as black music. But the notion that Cuban dancehall was coupled with it right here shows how well established this was as we move forward in the years. You know, oftentimes jazz and musical traditions are portrayed as a means of a metaphor of a tree. It's constructed like a family tree, and this is, I'm going to read briefly from my book. The roots, the trunk, the branches demonstrate kinship relationships of influence and indebtedness. In this depiction here, it was drawn by Herbie Mann, a white jazz musician from the United States who dedicated much of his professional career to playing Latin jazz. In typical fashion, Africa is centered in the root system along with the colonizing cultures of the New World. In this particular case, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Brazil serve as the trunk and the lowest branches in this Latin jazz tree. The outer branches encompass specific genres and major innovators, many of whom I discuss in my book. Various branches are then interconnected by jazz musicians who are represented like vines that fluidly traverse the tree from style to style and place to place. Man himself is depicted in that role. He appears in two spaces in the canopy of the tree, connecting jazz, Brazil, and Cuba. Conceiving of Latin jazz in this way has some benefits, as it acknowledges the shared past of a validly metaphorical way that represents the kinship relations among innovative musicians. However, once again, it relegates Latin jazz to being a separate, singular tree, not necessarily connected to the other conifers growing in the same forest. As a separate entity, the Latin jazz tree does not capture the full extent of the cross-pollination, the intercultural exchange, and the intrinsic interconnectivity, the truly global breadth of the music. If we must conceive of jazz or Latin jazz in this way, we must clarify which species of tree, and I've decided to come up with a different metaphor. I suggest the model of the aspen tree. You see, aspen forests are not collections of individual trees, but rather all one organism sharing the same root system. The forest is a singular tree. Aspens are considered the second largest living organism on Earth, second only to the Great Barrier Reef. Within each sprout, the same DNA and past history are embodied. In jazz, each iteration and substyle and performance resonates the music's past, its roots and its social history reaching back to the mid-1700s. In an aspen forest, each manifestation of the organism looks like a distinctive tree with unique features, but just beneath the tree's outward appearance, they are fundamentally the same. The same can be said of the musicians and their respective distinctive jazz styles, all sharing the same DNA. Conceived of this way, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Tito Puente, Machito, Mario Bauza, Dizzy Gillespie, Chano Pozo, and every other musician discussed in this book are unified and interconnected on the most fundamental and foundational level. All manifestations of jazz are intercultural, transnational, and multivocal at their core. I was playing with Tito Puente at Blue Note, one of his last performances in New York City, and as we were sitting backstage, he had a surprise guest. And it made me think of the root system that's up on here on the screen, how you can see how all of them are connected with a singular root system. In walked Max Roach, one of the greatest jazz drummers of all time. Both of them embraced. They had been friends since the 1940s. They sat giggling like little children on the couch backstage at the Blue Note, sharing stories and sharing gigs and stages that they had shared and played together. This is what an aspen forest looks like. Thank you. Let's see if I can stop sharing. Let's see. Strange. Oh, there it is. Good.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. That wonderful introduction to your work. And I guess next, Miguel.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for having me, and hello everyone was joining us today. It's really great to be here and to get to share some thoughts on this wonderful book. I know Chris for a while, and I know he's very passionate about all this. So it's really great to see it all coming together and this great work. And being involved in some way is also a great honor for me. There's there's a lot of ways I could go about this, and I know we have a limited amount of time. I think maybe the best way to start would be to give you a little, just kind of give you a little background information about myself and how I connect with this subject in particular. I grew up in Puerto Rico, born and raised there. I went to a performing arts music school there, middle school and high school, called Escuela Libre de Música in San Juan. That's where I started playing music when I was 11 years old. My training there was exclusively classical. So I studied classical saxophone for 6 years there, from age 11 to age 17. And it's sort of where I got where I connected with an instrument for the first time, where I connected with the alto saxophone, where I still play today. I would say about midway through school, when it was probably about 10th grade, ninth grade, 10th grade, I started playing professionally. I started making some money off music for the first time, playing mostly, well, no, mostly exclusively dance music, salsa and merengue, most specifically. So that was really the first time that I got a feel for, what it felt like to play music and connect with others, people who would dance to the music and react in a physical type of way, not something that was outside a formal kind of theater type of interaction. And this is also where I started getting my first experiences in improvisation. And one of the points that I like to always emphasize about improvisation is that musical improvisation is something that's not exclusive of jazz, obviously. It's something that exists in many styles of music all over the world, especially folklore music. And it's something that I started doing at an early age, playing salsa and merengue and like getting my feet wet, coming up with some ideas, really not knowing anything, but just my ears and whatever information I had under my fingers from studying. A little after that, I would say probably a year or so after that, I discovered jazz for the first time through friends passing around, Charlie Parker tapes and Miles Davis tapes at school. I had no idea who they were. I'd never heard, I hadn't even heard the term jazz before. But I was really blown away by many things about this music that I hadn't really experienced before. And I've been playing music up to this point, but I hadn't really experienced the things that jazz presented to me, which were not only the idea of improvisation, but improvisation kind of rooted to a very specific and very detailed language, And I heard this master's musicians, as an alto player here in Charlie Parker, playing the way he played with that amount of technique and control on the instrument and playing over, a harmonic progression that was complex and fast and, had a lot of great information in it. It just literally blew my mind. And from that point on, I really just became obsessed with the idea of understanding what they were doing. And I'll say even a little more than that. Up to that point, I hadn't even considered being a musician. It wasn't even in the back of my mind. My life was kind of taking me somewhere else. Even though I was playing music, I was like, this is not. I don't want to do this for a living. I want to do something else. Jazz changed that for me. You know, uh, and digging a little deeper, I started hearing, Bird playing with Machito, and Dizzy playing with Chanaposo and learning tunes and a bossa nova craze. And at 16 years old, I was starting to put the two together and saying, okay, so there's some kind of connection here. This is something that I can grab while I'm listening to this masters and trying to learn. There's also a connection to me as a Latin American individual. So, I kind of started finding my way through it. And, I think pretty early on, I understood that for me personally, what really called me about this music, what this idea of an intellectual side sort of balanced out with something that was heartfelt, that was personality and heart and a lot of feeling into it. It was like the combination of those two things was really what attracted me to the music. But also, especially because I've been playing a lot of dance music up to that point. So a lot of the music that I heard that, you know, combined elements of jazz music with the music that I have been playing up to that point wasn't as attractive to me, to be honest. It was great to hear it, and it was great to hear people playing on top of that and improvising. But I felt that I really wanted to dig deeper into what the language was, So I started going into transcriptions and trying to learn as an instrumentalist what that meant to me. And I went doing that for a very long time. I basically forgot about the stuff that I was doing early on. I was just like, I'm just gonna do that. I'm gonna be a jazz head for a while and just Bird and Cannibal and Coltrane and Miles and Sonny Rollins, and that's all I did through college. And I really just wanted to understand the language. And it wasn't until I had to stop and really sort of try to define what it was that I was looking for as a person, that I had to take a step back and say, wait, I'm doing all this stuff up to this point, but I have to take a step back and look at my upbringing. I have to look at my music. I have to look at Puerto Rico and the culture and the folklore and the history, and see what that means to me, especially now as living in the United States and seeing it from that perspective. So I started going through that process, the music that I grew up playing, but I really didn't know how to explain it, or I couldn't really put my finger on something, the difference between one thing and the other, in terms of styles and development and families and all this stuff. So I went back and really kind of submerged myself in that information, and eventually was able to come up with something that, I was able to come up with a sort of compromise, I guess I would say, between what it meant to me to be connected to this music that was my music. I feel was my first language: Latin American music, Puerto Rican music, music from the Caribbean, dance music, folklore, and my second language, which was in this case jazz, and trying to marry the two and come up with something that I felt not only portrayed my experience up to that point, becoming a musician and become, developing a persona, musical persona, but also my identity as a Puerto Rican, as a Latin American musician, you know, uh, immersed in this music that we call jazz. So it was just great to hear, and I mean, it's great to read and also hear now, Chris, your thoughts about your process. The book is so. I mean, it's so. It's the research is so amazing, and you can really get lost on so many details that you can really just focus on that and kind of just find this loophole that could take you in so many places. So for me, that was one of the great things about it, just seeing how far back you went and how you kind of developed it into coming into something that's happening today. But a few things come to mind. One thing is jazz as a genre that's very inclusive and has been very inclusive from the beginning. Just like you mentioned, even before it was we know anything about jazz. I think the music that eventually became this music was grabbing from everywhere, and grabbing. It was being, it was having injections from information from all over the place, and definitely from Latin America specifically. And I would say from the beginning, and we listened to the music of Jelly Roll Morton and all the giants from that time, Louis Armstrong, and you go on and on and on up to now, and you can see that this music has always been there. Um, and then we get to the figure of Dizzy Gillespie, which I think, it's important to mention Dizzy, not because he invented what this is, like Chris mentioned, this was happening already, but I think what Dizzy did was, and I think put it in context, when Dizzy started doing that, he was already Dizzy. He was already like one of the main guys, well respected, one of the great. He was already considered a groundbreaking musician. So in a way, he didn't really have to do this. He could have just played something else, and he would have probably been fine. So he really made a very conscious attempt to go this way because he called them. He felt that he connected them to Africa, to the motherland. He could go through the prism of, in this case, Afro-Cuban music and see what his ancestors were doing, and he felt very strongly about that. Um, but another thing to think about, and not only about Dizzy, but also, Charlie Parker and a lot of the musicians who were kind of living in both worlds in this time, is that as great as they were, they knew very little about this music. They didn't know, they couldn't tell between a guaguancó and a jambu, or music, or a rumba from Matanzas, or Havana. They didn't know anything about that. They were just kind of, taking what the information that they had, and because it was incredible, oh, I want to use that, and I want to bring that into my music, and that opened the door for all those other things. Eventually, people opening the door into music from Brazil, which is also a very specific thing, this bossa nova thing, and other things. But I think something that I think about a lot is that, as great as that was, what Dizzy did, because he was really great and it was amazing, and all those musicians, what they did and what's been done up to this point. I think nowadays, uh, you can really find musicians, who can actually do both things, and I think it's a testament to not only how the this relationship has grown over the years, but how it's still there. It's still, after all this time, and we could talk about 100 years, we could talk about 400 years, like Chris was saying before, 300, 400 years, it's always been there, and it always be there, and I feel, I'm not really into labels and terms, and I understand we could use terms to be very specific about something, or something else, but this idea of Latin American musicians of finding their way, and finding an identity through jazz. You could also see it the other way, like you talk in your book, Chris. I mean, I think jazz has gotten as much from Latin American music as it's been the other way around, and I think at this point we can sort of, I mean, and this is kind of a personal thing, we can kind of start blurring a lot of this terminology and a lot of this frontiers, right? And just say this is music that's very inclusive, and grows by the day, right? So I think our definition of what this music is, and as we, the history that's written every day with new musicians and new sounds and all these things that are happening, grows day by day. Um, I think we can say that this is a relationship that's here to stay, and it's always been there. And as a Latin American musician trying to find my way through this music, I feel lucky. I feel lucky to be around, and experience these things, both past, getting to listen to all the stuff that Dizzy did, and the stuff before him and after him, and all the great things that are being done now. Uh, uh, that could fall and add to this relationship as it grows, and it just becomes, I believe, uh, I don't want to say essential, but it becomes more and more part of the DNA of what this music is, without really getting into terms. It's just a natural and an organic way of growing as the music grows, and being acknowledged as such. So in any case, thank you for having me, Chris. I'll pass it along, and maybe come back later.
Uh, Thank you, Miguel. I think my comments that are coming next will touch on some of the same things. So I want to say what an honor it is to be part of Things Today with such esteemed co-panelists. And it's also a privilege just to be able to spend some time talking about this latest book from a colleague and a friend, Chris Washburne. But there's a lot to unpack in Chris's book, but in the short amount of time I have today, I'd like to focus on two concerns he and I happen to share. One is an interest in the role of intercultural exchange, as he puts it, in the formation of musical genres and traditions. The other is the often unseen, unheard career choices professional musicians face in order to piece together a viable living. And again, I think this goes to some of the comments Miguel is mentioning. You'll have to read Chris's book, something I invite everyone to do, to enjoy all of the rich musical and biographical details he rallies in support of his argument that however much we can debate the definition of Latin jazz, we should hear the music's creolized core, the multiplicity and heterogeneity at the heart of its churning rhythms, its gathering of lineages and histories articulated through dance steps, finger snaps, and horn stabs. And in fact, Chris makes an even stronger claim than Jelly Morton for Latin music's role in the formation of jazz. If anything, rather than Latin jazz struggling to fit into a jazz mainstream, jazz could be thought of as a North American continental version of Afro-Caribbean music traditions. Focusing on the Caribbean as a central locus of music's meanings and movements, Chris describes the process of creolization as a form of intercultural exchange in which, quote, merging, dissolving, and ambiguous play are decentered with no apparent fixed boundaries, end quote. Chris's analytical pressure on the term Latin jazz reveals the porousness of generic boundaries, while demystifying the discourse that forges hard links between notions of racial purity and musical sound, ethnic essence, and musical tradition. In the case of Latin jazz, there is its long history of intercultural exchanges among African slaves, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and the Americas, and European settlers and colonizers that laid in the historical groundwork for the conditions of possibility leading to the formation of various musical traditions in Havana and New Orleans, as well as in other nodes and spaces of musical activity beyond the two cities. And that's a history that Chris fleshes out in his book. A key problematic then is accounting for racial mixture and transcultural exchange against notions that link purity of blood, of tradition, with authenticity, and thus with authority and legitimacy in a given tradition or genre within musical discourse. This linkage impacts the musical aesthetic and social value granted to a particular piece of music or the work of a particular musician. This in turn, as Chris astutely analyzes, has material and not only discursive consequences. One of the key aspects of Chris's work I always find so compelling is the way in which he continually connects a heady theorizing of concepts such as intercultural exchange as a mode of musical creation or as an aesthetic charge to the on-the-ground materiality of the lived experience of a working musician. As he puts it, quote, what is most often overlooked in historical analyses is that music is not only an expressive art, but also a business. And a gig is a gig, end quote. The ways in which the economic life of a working musician and interculturality interact can be seen in Latin jazz musicians as self-conscious performances of otherness. While easily criticized today, we might more charitably recognize their actions as the marketing strategies of professional musicians working from marginalized positions. As Chris points out, Latin music artists have long looked beyond local markets, and there has always been the need to satisfy the demands of diasporic and migratory populations of Latin music listeners as well. In this way, Latin music artists have always been global, selling their localness to a global audience. While this has often meant performing stereotypical ethnic representations, the use of specific musical, visual, and/or performative tropes can be heard as attempts to draw distinctions between themselves and other global musicians circulating in a competitive global marketplace. Often trading in representations, musicians and audiences readily acknowledged as exaggerations or worse. More fundamentally, the higher remuneration as well as ability to perform alternative, even dignified or ironic versions of stereotypical representations in public spaces to wide audiences could provide more immediate motivations for pursuing a professional music career. I'll end with an event that I also discuss in my latest book. Both Latin jazz and Hawaiian music lost their individual Grammy Awards in 2011, along with 29 other categories, most, if not all, from marginal, often explicitly racialized vernacular music genres. Hawaiian musicians largely shrugged their shoulders, and their participation in the Grammys has remained low ever since. Latin musicians, such as Arturo Farrell, however, organized and agitated for reinstatement, and the Latin Jazz Grammy Award returned a year later. Why are these Grammy narratives important to remember? Because Grammy nominations and wins have real economic effects. It is not merely symbolic capital at stake. With a Grammy win, particularly for musicians working in non-mainstream popular or vernacular music genres, their visibility can be enhanced beyond a small regional or secondary market, leading to more prestigious gigs, more lucrative contract offers, and other opportunities. By placing the histories of the Latin Jazz Grammy controversy and the jazz canonization project that has marginalized Latin jazz musicians side by side, which he does in chapter 5, the symbiotic relationship between cultural and economic capital becomes glaringly clear. As demonstrated in 2 vignettes that bookend Latin jazz, and for which I don't have time to get into today, and that actually I'm going to use as an incentive to invite you to read his book, that in these two vignettes, Latin jazz musicians perform Latin jazz as well as quote unquote real jazz, with a skill that makes their music seem both natural and otherworldly. But as Chris points out, it should be unsurprising given the underlying rhizomatic nature of intercultural exchange between already intertwined lineages and histories that are articulated in the sounding out and the dancing with, the soloing above, and the collaborating among, in the musicking, in other words, that we might just call Latin jazz. Thank you.
Go? Yes. So first of all, I want to thank Heyman, Side Fellows, Kay, Sang, and of course, Chris for this incredible book and for this invitation. I'm also thrilled to be in the same panel with Miguel Senon and Kevin Fellis. It seems to me that one of the great services that a panel on a book can do is to really stimulate people to want to read this book and buy this book. There are many, many reasons to do that. I will start by saying that it is a true pleasure to read this book. It actually took me longer than I thought it would because I stopped to listen to the references, comparing them. It was a thoroughly enjoyable process. I am not a music scholar, and I just came out of writing something about Arthur Schomburg and visuality, and I think my comments very much are intertwined as I was reading Chris' book. So I want to focus on three things, and then to quote a notable quote, Oye como va. Although this book is about music, one way that I would describe it is as a counter-visual account of jazz by way of Latin jazz. And by what I mean by a counter-visual, and by extension, you could maybe also call it a counter-audiovisual account, is precisely because, as Kevin mentioned, it sees the unseen. It hears the unheard and addresses a violence which is committed not only against Latinos in music or Latinos in general, but also about all of us in some way. The complexity of our relationships and the possibilities that are part of that. I started noticing this very strong counter-visual component to the book by making a list, as this is the literary scholar coming in, making a list of all the words, concepts that were invoked in the book to note this violence. Overlooked, ignored, erased, omitted, unwritten, unrecognized, unacknowledged, neglected, ancillary, mislabeled, exoticized, othered, diminished. Another way to see the countervisuality beyond the actual terms that are visual is juxtaposing certain very eye-opening passages that Chris has in the book. For instance, and this might not be, for instance, one writer who, I quote Chris, who wishes to remain anonymous, commented, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, for some reason, if the record, we're talking vinyl, wasn't straight ahead jazz, they, the publication, would penalize it. For instance, every time I would review an Eddie Palmieri record and give it 5 stars, they would publish the review with only 4 stars. In Louis Armstrong's version of the Peanut Vendor, which is originally from Cuba, a Cuban tune, all musicians are listed except those playing percussions. This countervisuality that I feel Chris's book advances, however, is not a diversity and inclusion industry type of claim. More it is that by showing what is not seen and relating it in a certain Latin jazz way, the book tries really to shift how we understand ourselves, our relationship to others, and the stories that shape us. And he does this by underscoring the very different processes by which music is made, canons are imposed, nationalities are affirmed, and business plans are executed. And here, when he talks about this process in this Latin jazz way, he adopts a very different vocabulary. He talks about copying and synchronicity and interculturality and Creoleness and transnational and multivocal. And to give an example of how that method of juxtaposition works, and then maybe not entirely fair, comparing Chris's prose with House Resolution 57 from the US Congress from 1987. But I think the juxtaposition reveals part of Chris's method and also what's at stake in the method. So the House Resolution says, jazz has achieved preeminence throughout the world as an indigenous, meaning Native American music and art form, a uniquely American musical synthesis and culture through the African-American experience. Jazz is hereby designated a rare and valuable national American treasure. In one of the passages that Chris describes how Latin jazz intertwines and is synchronous with jazz in general, he talks about Azpiazu, a white Cuban band leader, and says, Azpiazu appropriated and mediated Black street culture to cater to popular white notions of Afro-Cuban Blackness, all the while undermining the established and prejudicial racial divides in the milieus in which he performed through his multiracial hiring practices. For Armstrong and Ellington as Black jazz musicians, their renditions of the Peanut Vendor appropriated Azpiazu's appropriation, all the while negotiating their own positions within confines of white notions of stage Blackness, simultaneously by pointing to a more otherness than their own positions as Black entertainers within white performance domains. They could, each in his own way, appropriate rather than be the object of appropriation. I feel like the juxtaposition of those two passages says a lot about what we're missing in these simpler narratives. Ultimately, by generating and combining various different forms of knowledge differently, Chris makes an argument for a fundamental epistemological shift. And in that process, among the many ways that this is done in the book, I want to underscore a concept that he introduces that I think we could discuss more, which is the concept of Black archipelago. It's not entirely defined in the book. It appears in different moments. But I find even the reference to archipelago pretty fruitful as a way to think about other epistemological ways about telling these stories. In my own work and that of other people working on archipelagos around the world, one of the reasons we're using the term archipelago is to reframe the notion of island. For instance, the island of Cuba, the island of Puerto Rico, the island of Trinidad or Hawaii. While there are certainly island masses that could be called these names, none of these places are islands. And I feel this has tremendous repercussions because islands are often imagined as Latinos and immigrants and other groups as isolated, disposable, vulnerable, exotic, other, far away. Archipelago then allows us to see the world not as islands, but as interconnected networks of land and ocean, I guess a variation of the aspen tree, and to relativize the ideological notion of mainland or trunk or nation. It also allows us for other practices of relating, visiting over invading, exchanging over extracting, nuance over binaries. So it feels to me at the end that Chris' book is about a certain music, a certain way, which is to say about new forms of being and forms of living, which we need in all domains. So thank you so much, Chris.
Wow. And I'm supposed to respond to all of that? My word, what a dream team of panelists. Thank you so much for reading these so closely and saying some of the thoughts that I have so much more eloquently than I could write them. And I'm deeply touched. Where to begin? Yes, Francis, when I saw that House Resolution 57, and the way that it was declaring jazz, it was a very important moment in jazz, right? It happened in the 1980s. It was a moment where jazz musicians were really struggling, and it was the first time that black music had been recognized in a kind of that political center of the United States. And what it did is it opened up the music for arts funding. It started to align it with classical music. But of course, as soon as you say that jazz is a rare treasure and is meant for the museum, you're basically killing it off. It's it's putting it in a sarcophagus and to be preserved. And the reality of my life as a jazz musician was that jazz is vibrant and very much alive. We must keep in mind that jazz emerges as the most popular music in the world in the aftermath of the biggest pandemic that we had had for hundreds of years. And why is that? Because it's so vibrant and it's so fluid and adaptable that jazz musicians were able to create things that built upon what happened prior to that and persevered throughout to come up with something truly spectacularly gorgeous and popular and captivating and compelling. And one of the definitions that I find so appropriate for jazz has been told by many people, but I heard it from Bill Easley, the saxophone player that played with Ellington and Basie, the big bands, and he said jazz is a beautiful response to adversity. And in that sense, jazz is a verb, and you can't kill a verb. It's about living. And so, first of all, it bodes well for the future of this music and the future of jazz when we get out of this pandemic that we're currently in. I cannot wait to hear the jazz response to that. But indeed, I look at Latin jazz and that kind of cultural interchange as something very vibrant and very much alive. And so it gives me great hope when I hear this music. I also feel as though islands are never isolating, right? Because they're so easy to come and go with, either through by flying or through boats. They're not landlocked. There's a flow. There's a fluidity, and it's just like even during the embargo in Cuba, they could still hear the radio airwaves coming, and they penetrated those boundaries, those economic structures that were in place to keep the musicians far apart. But no matter what, we still had access to all those bootleg recordings of Cuban music at that time, even though they were illegal to have. And it was unstoppable. Music penetrates. It penetrates walls. It penetrates neighborhoods. It doesn't stop at barriers. I mean, anybody that lives in a New York City apartment knows that. And in some ways, music tells the future. It's like one of the few art forms that actually foretells the future, right? The function of music in society is like you're walking down the street and you hear a siren, you know an ambulance is coming before you see it. That's what music does. And that's why it's so important to listen so closely and carefully, deeply, because what resounds in those sounds is this entire history. And Kevin, absolutely, this relationship that Kevin mentioned of creolization, of kind of new hybrids emerging from various strains, and musicians taking the materials they had at hand, which is the jazz aesthetic, right, to persevere in the face of adversity and create something new, create something beautiful with scant materials at times. I mean, it's the experience, the whole colonial experience and the African American experience is centered right in that, but it's a black experience that's shared throughout these nations that are not only in the United States but throughout the Americas and throughout the Caribbean. And so it's truly kind of at its fundamental heart is this exchange of ideas. And it is a testament to the beauty that can come when diverse peoples come together, othered peoples come together. Instead of battle, what can you do? You can make beautiful music together and you can dance. And indeed, it's where racial segregation happened in this country way before any other place. And it was Don Aspiazzo and his Havana Casino Orchestra playing in Midtown was the very first time that you had an interracial performance amongst white audiences to see that. It's not what the musicians were doing, you know, in jam sessions at night. There was desegregation happening on bandstands throughout the United States and the Caribbean way before it happened here. That's telling the future. It shows you what is possible and what can happen. Just like the dance floors of the Palladium was one of the first truly interracial dance floors that happened. Why? It was the music that brought those people there and brought them to mix in an unprecedented way. And Kevin, your work, and same with Francis, has been such a big inspiration. But Kevin, in particular, your work with how you deal with jazz history has been an inspiration for me, and I'm so glad. I think everybody now that's here understands why you're an inspiration. The way that you're able to synthesize ideas and kind of see deeply into these ideas and the importance of them. And thank you for bringing that example up with the Hawaiian musicians and being excluded from the Grammys, because it was a terrible thing. It was a fight that a lot of people had to bring in, including Arturo, but Bobby Sanabria, Eddie Palmieri. There was like a whole list of musicians that stood up and really spoke out at that moment against that. And, you know, Miguel, you've been a huge inspiration to me in a number of levels, in terms of playing, and also how you actually sound out what I'm talking about, and how you embrace that aspirin forest, and also bring your traditions together on the highest level of jazz, and you've been recognized for it. That's the reason I wrote about you in the last chapter, as someone who's actually doing that and represents the direction that this music is going to. And so I thank you for that insight, and I thank you for your personal account of your own story. I included that in my book because it was important for people to hear that there's these alternative trajectories with very important voices in this music. And I can see in terms of the panelists, along with the panelists, but the attendees that are here, there are several people that have showed up that actually played a very significant role in this book, and I just want to shout out to them. Enid Farber is one of the most gifted photographers in Latin music and jazz in New York City, and I include photos of her compelling photos in every single book and article I write, and she's here. Thank you so much, Enid, for those beautiful photos. Beatrice Goubert is here. She was one of my assistants in doing the research, and she helped me so much in the publication of this book. And then also, as I hope I don't miss anybody here, also a person who was been one of the biggest inspirations in terms of his research in Cuba and his connection to the Caribbean, and someone that I quote widely is Ned Sublette. Thank you so much for all of your work as well. And then, of course, there are some musicians here that have played with me in my own Latin jazz band. Zoli Matheson is here. And then there's Nancy Lemberger, who is in this audience listening and being a big promoter of this music, and same with Neda Martinez. Thank you so much for being here. And that's my response. Kevin, we can't hear you.
Hello. Yes. Well, thank you, Chris and Miguel and Francis. I guess we're getting a question from Audrey. I guess I'll read her question, and I think we're only probably have time for Audrey's question. And I'll put in, I guess, a link for the book to buy the book will be put into the chat as well. So,
there's also a code on the Society of Fellows site that announces this, that gives you a 30% discount. So please, buy in bulk.
All right. So Audrey's question is: thank you for a fascinating series of talks. It seems to me that the political movement across the spectrum is very interested in purity and cultural specificity as opposed to hybridity. Do you see your work as a counter-political intervention within this context? Could you detail the historical investment in erasing this particular history of cultural exchange?
Oh, Audrey, thank you so much for that wonderful question. You know, part of the erasure, and I document this in the book, has to do with the kind of way that the United States is defined as a binary of black and white. There's not much space for anything in between that. And of course, what happens is that when you're creating a historical narrative, the very first historical narratives that came out were oftentimes written by white male scholars in the mid 20th century that were very interested in promoting jazz and the music that they loved. And what ends up happening is that they had to create and canonize and create a neat narrative in order to support it. And in some ways, their idea was to move it into the academy, to make it worthy of study, an object of study. So there was this kind of scholarly pursuit. There's also advocacy and promotion. And throughout most of the 20th century, that wasn't really interrogated too much, right? It was really, people were pushing for this music to be accepted as something more than just popular music of the day. So in other words, when they would create compilations of Louis Armstrong's greatest works, despite the fact that in 1930, The Peanut Vendor was his #1 hit song, they would not include that. And they would include other things instead, so that it would create this, in other words, how can you attribute a Cuban song becoming a #1 hit song by the most famous jazz musician in 1930? It doesn't fit neatly into compartmentalizing this trajectory that you're going to talk about, that'll eventually get into HR 57, where it's African American music, and it's a rare national treasure. That's where it was moving to. And so there's no space for anything that is perceived as not African American. But the harsh reality is, you go to New Orleans, and even if you visit there today, you'll notice that the architecture is different, the food is different, the music sounds different, the people talk different. Why? Because culturally it has a different trajectory than the rest of a lot of places in the United States. And if we're talking about that early music, then how do you grapple with this kind of erasure and this silencing? And as Francis says, violence, absolutely. So, as something that I disagree with Duke Ellington when he said that no music is political, I think all music is political, and all writing about music is definitely political. And absolutely, it's me pushing back, especially at this moment, right? This is a significant historical moment. We're on the precipice of huge change, not only in terms of race relations in this country, but also what's going to happen after the pandemic. And in more so than at any other time, even though I've been working on this intervention for quite some time, it is the moment where we need these kind of interventions to fully understand the moment we're in. Think about it. The pop stars of today, who are they? I mean, how is it possible that J-Lo and Mark Anthony and Christina Aguilera, and we can go on and on and on, or Beyonce is putting out videos where she's referencing Santeria ceremonies? Like, why is that possible? How did that happen? How did Bad Bunny happen? How is it possible that the #1 hit song in the United States could be from a Spanish-speaking artist? You cannot understand this if you don't understand this history that's in this book, that it's always been there. And there's a reason why the Peanut Vendor becomes a huge hit in 1930 in Spanish, and at different moments and other times and stuff that and this is something that Francis writes on so eloquently as well. These pop stars that emerge. I love your work on Ricky Martin and also J-Lo and many others. So I highly recommend that as well for everybody that's here. So, yeah, Audrey, it's a pushback.
Thanks. Oh, did you want to say something, Francis?
I just wanted to say that one of the reasons I think the book is valuable across fields is that what you're describing is present across fields. Like, you could pretty much do a very similar account of other art forms, but also of everyday life. There's a general erasure that blocks possibilities, blocks not only in the arts, but of constructing new ways of relating to each other, new ways of narrating our history, new ways of building a future together, right? So I just wanted to say that that's one of the key reasons to buy this book, which is it connects to all these other scholarship debates and political questions. Because at the end, why write these things anyway if it's not to transform this violence, and eliminate this violence and create other types, more enabling forms.
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment on, thank you, Francis, for bringing up the archipelago, because in the Pacific studies, there's that same idea, right, of, and here I'm borrowing off of Haufa's articulation of islands, that the islanders don't see the water as separating the islands, but as connecting the islands, right? So, and there really is one ocean in the world, right? And so the connections between the Caribbean and the Pacific aren't as, right, they're there, they're not as tentative. And again, like Chris points out in his historical rendering, that, these things have been, people have been circulating, culture has been circulating and hybridizing, and, banging up against each other and mixing and all sorts of things, right?
I just have one more comment, and I before we go, I know we're almost out of time, but it doesn't seem right to be talking about a book that's on Latin jazz without letting the music have the last say. I'll share with you my screen one more time, really briefly, and you'll just see my blank countertop, and I'll come here. And what I want to do is play something from Miguel Zinon, and play one of my favorite cuts, which really addresses race, but it also is a tribute to one of the greatest Puerto Rican singers of all time, Ismael Rivera. And this was one of his hits, El Negro Bembón, which is a famous song, that Cuban song that gets referenced in a number of places. And it's about, it's about police violence and street violence as well. Anyway, I'd like to just listen to a minute or so of this and let Miguel have the last say. And also you understand why he is such an important figure in this music today, and why he's in my book, and why we invited him here today. So I hope you pick up a copy of that too, and include, as well as the book. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Chris.
And thank you, Miguel, Francis, and everyone who's come and attended today. Thank you all. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I again invite everyone to go and pick up Chris's book. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.